What we're going to do this evening is not the Gemorah. Right? We're not doing the Gemorah this evening. Instead, what we're doing is information that will be necessary in order to be able to continue learning this Gemorah. In other words, to get to the next piece, you need this background information, and fortunately or unfortunately, this background information is actually quite involved. So it might take us a bit of time to unpack the various elements of this background information. But before... What we've got to do before the background... No, but the normal week, you're actually reading information in the Gemorah. We will be reading information in other Gemorahs, not in our Gemorah. Okay? To give you context. So let's just understand where we are in the Gemorah so we know what's happening next. We started off with the Mishnah, as one does. The Mishnah, or at least the part of the Mishnah that we are most focused on at the moment, is the part where you've got these two individuals who are fighting over who has the rights to a particular item. We're calling the item a Tallis. Tallis is not a religious object. Tallis means a garment. How they got into the situation, there are two possibilities. They either both believe they found it in the street at the same time, or they both were in negotiations with a seller and somehow they confused everybody and each of them thinks they're the one who bought it. So they're now in this point of conflict. So the first thing that the Gemorah had to do was just give us a little bit of insight. What exactly are the cases, as I've just described to you? The Gemorah had to arrive at that conclusion. What exactly are the cases that the Mishnah is dealing with? That was the first segment of this Gemorah. The second segment, which we've just concluded, last week we concluded the second segment. So the second segment says, look, if you have a Mishnah, as we do, that does not quote the name of any rabbis, that's because the implication is that all the rabbis agree with the principles of this Mishnah. The only time we quote the name of a rabbi in a Mishnah is if he has a dissenting opinion. So if you've got a Mishnah without any dissenting opinion, the implication is everybody agrees. So the Gemorah says, well, let's test if that is true. And we found three scenarios that sound very similar to our Mishnah. And we brought the rabbis of each of those three scenarios and said, where do they fall in this conversation? Because they seem to be saying something different. And then slowly but surely we resolved each of those issues. So we now have closed off that segment of the Gemorah and we're ready to start the next segment of the Gemorah that's going to behave quite differently to the sections that we've done up until now. Okay? So how does it behave differently? Well, now we're going to do something that is really, really unique compared to everything we've learned so far. What we're going to do is bring up the name of a rabbi, and he's not going to be brought as an issue or a contradiction to our Mishnah. To the contrary, we're going to quote a rabbi. We're going to talk about what this rabbi says, and then we're going to suggest that our Mishnah would actually support this rabbi's opinion. In other words, this rabbi we're going to quote is not a Mishnah period rabbi, he's a Gemorah period rabbi. And we're going to say this rabbi who made this comment, he can lean on our Mishnah, maybe it will support what he has to say. And once we open that conversation, then it becomes this very involved conversation of, well, is it? Is it a support to what he's going to say? So, why is that so much of an introduction to an introduction kind of thing? Because we've got to now understand what this rabbi is talking about, what the background is for his statement, what the halachic elements are that are associated with his statement. And only once we have an introductory picture to all of those things can we start to put this puzzle together. And it is going to be a puzzle, and it's going to be a puzzle with quite a number of pieces in it. In fact, this is a Gemorah that's going to effectively stretch over I think more than a page actually, which is quite something, that a segment should be that involved, that it goes on for that long. We haven't had that yet, right? We haven't had such an involved conversation yet that is going to take so much time and is going to take, firstly, so much information, and secondly, introduce us to a method that is not part of Western thinking. So we're really going to have to get ourselves used to the kind of things that are going on over here. So what our objective is this evening is to just get the main halachic elements that are relevant to this conversation. So whatever we're learning right now is outside of the context of our Gemorah. Occasionally I might throw out, how does this compare with our Gemorah? But really what we're trying to achieve at this point is just objectively gain relevant information so we have a knowledge base that we can use to then approach the next segment of the Gemorah. Okay, you ready for that? What better way to start a piece of Gemorah than with a stick figure cartoon to illustrate the principle that we're dealing. Now that I've worked out how to make stick figure cartoons, you're going to get a lot of them. So here we got two characters, as you can see, and two Hebrew words above those characters. Do you see that? So we're calling this segment owning up to what you owe. Before we look at these two people in this caricature, in this little cartoon, let's role play a few different scenarios. Scenario number 1. Rowan comes to Gary and says, you owe me 1,000 rand. And Gary says, no. What happens next?
Fight.
So Rowan, can you get your money?
I'd like to.
You'd like to, but can you get your money?
Probably not.
Why not?
It's scary.
Because, frankly, it's your word against Gary's word. And there's no reason that we should take one person's word over another person's word to the extent that we're going to make them have to pay money. Different scenario. Okay, that's scenario 1. Scenario 2. Rowan, you come to Gary and you produce an IOU note that is signed by Gary that says that he owes you 1,000 rand. And Gary says, no, not true. Now what?
Same problem.
Is it the same problem? You have an IOU. Not in the Gemorah's days. So what do you do now? You could go to court, right? In the first case, you could have also gone to court. The court would have thrown it out and said, what must we do? It's you versus him. There's no case. Here there's a case, right? There's some kind of documentation that illustrates that you owe the money. So the court's going to have to test the veracity of that document. And if that document stands up in court, then Gary's going to have to pay. Unless he can prove that somehow he has a receipt from you to say that you got the money or something like that. Okay. Next scenario. Well, Rowan goes to court and says, there's this guy, Gary. He owes me 1,000 rand. And he won't pay me. But don't worry, because I have Yossi and Craig as witnesses who know that Gary owes me this money. Now what's going to happen? What's the court going to say? Call the witnesses. And if the witnesses stand up in court and they apparently are trustworthy individuals, whatever, then Gary's got to pay the money.
But what about him answering?
You can answer, but you can't answer against witnesses. Witnesses are more powerful than an individual, even if the individual is one of the litigants. Okay, so far, so good. Let's make this a totally different scenario. So because it's a totally different scenario, we're going to switch the characters. Gary comes to Rowan and says, Rowan, you owe me 1,000 rand. And Rowan says, yes, I do. What's the halacha? Of course he must pay. It's not a hard one. Of course he must pay. He acknowledges that he owes the money. He must pay the money. It's very simple. All of that was the introduction to this cartoon. Because in this cartoon, stick figure A, because I'm not going to say that anybody here looks like anybody in the thing. So stick figure A comes to stick figure B and says, you owe me $1,000. Stick figure B says, no, I only owe you $500. So far we've looked at denial or admission. This is neither. This is partial admission and partial denial. So now what? What do you do now? This, do you see those two Hebrew words at the top? This is what we call moideh be miktsas. So you get up in the morning, you say Modeh Ani. What does Modeh mean?
Thankful.
We had this conversation once before. Right? It's not just that I'm thankful. Modeh means I acknowledge. I acknowledge that you gave me back my soul. I acknowledge you. So, Moide means I acknowledge your claim. Again, Gary said to Ron, you owe me money. I acknowledge your claim, but only be-miktsas. What's miktsas? Partially. For the word katzat, which is a little bit. So I'm only acknowledging part of your claim. What do we do in that case? Let's throw out some options. Be as wild in your thinking as you possibly can. Right?
Negotiate, you settle.
You settle. Well, he wants to settle. He's saying, I only owe you half. So what's the settlement? That he should pay half? Is that settling? No, that's not settling. He's got a claim of 1,000. So what does settling look like? Okay, so give me a suggestion. Give me an amount. 750. Because you take the part that's being debated and split it, right? Like in our Mishnah.
Yeah.
That's one option, okay? Can you suggest another option?
Prove why it does it.
Prove. Okay, and how can you prove something in halacha?
Contracts,
Witnesses. Because even if you have a contract, now the contract is being debated. It's not the guy's denying flatly the contract. He's denying how much of the contract is still relevant. You'd have to have witnesses. So the only thing you'd be able to bring in is witnesses. Witnesses are fine. That would resolve it. We've already discussed the case of witnesses. This is a case without
You
witnesses.
can also go to court for that.
And do what in court? You're right. You can go to court. Absolutely, you can go to court. Okay, what's the court going to do?
Is the document?
There are no witnesses.
What is the document says? 1,000 or 500?
Let's say there's no document.
Okay.
But even if there were a document, he could say, you're right, the document said 1,000, but I've already given you the first payment. Because there are no witnesses.
There's no receipt. There's no...
Okay, it's an interesting question. No. Last time we said there's no record in the ledger. Here you're talking about a receipt. This is between just two people. And it's very interesting because not in this Gemorah, but in other Gemorahs, we talk about the fact that in different communities, there were certain communities who always insisted on receipting, and there were certain communities who basically, there was a level of trust, or what they assumed was if you paid, then the person's supposed to give you the IOU note back so that they can't hold it against you. So the receipt wasn't necessarily a thing always. But let's make this as simple as possible and say there's no document. It's just one person's word against the other, but he's not flatly denying the claim against him. He's partially admitting the claim. So what do you think the courts can do to him in this case? Besides the one option which you suggested, which is let's take the amount that's in dispute and split it. In other words, pay 750 instead of 1,000. That's one possible solution. Any other possible solution you could think of?
Pay the full amount.
Pay the full amount. Why should he pay the full amount? He doesn't want to. He doesn't believe he has to. In his possession.
If he doesn't have the proof that he paid, if he doesn't have the proof that he paid anything back, then he basically owes 1,000.
But the other guy doesn't have any proof that he owes him anything. It's his word and his word.
It's only words.
It's only words.
There's no documents.
It's only words, no documents. I'm saying let's keep it as simple as that. Only words, no documents. What's that?
Take an oath.
Take an oath. Exactly.
Because I read it.
Okay. Well, I did say you should pull on our Mishnah, right? Our Mishnah spoke about the possibility of an oath. So take an oath. Now, there are oaths and there are oaths, as we already learned in our Mishnah, because if you remember, the final conclusion in our Mishnah was that the oath administered by our Mishnah is a, what kind of oath? Does anybody remember? Rabbinical oath. A rabbinical oath, and it's actually one of the least strict rabbinical oaths you can get, because the purpose of this oath was just to scare a person off from making a claim that isn't really appropriate to make. But there's another kind of oath. What's the other kind of oath?
Godly oath.
Correct. An oath that is mandated by the Torah. And if an oath is mandated by the Torah, then A, you have to find a place in the Torah that tells you that you've got to take this oath. And B, it's then a very serious oath. That's when they bring out the Torah. That's when they take the guy on the whole tour of the Beis Din and to read him the Riot Act and say that's one of the 10 commandments and the whole world could be destroyed from people like you who take Hashem's name in vain. You know, that's a very serious business. So which kind of oath would we make this guy take if he acknowledges half of the claim against him? A rabbinic oath or a Torah oath?
based on the Mishnah, rabbinical.
Rabbinical.
Based on the Mishnah, you'd say rabbinical, right? Okay.
So did you say we must ignore the Mishnah?
No. I said what we're learning here is not the topic of our Mishnah. And for all of this that we're learning at the moment is independent of our Mishnah, but we have to keep referring back.
So I'd say exactly the opposite. I'd say you'd say the Torah oath because it carries more weight.
Right?
And it's going to scare the person more, which is ultimately the desired effect.
Yes.
So listen, how determined are you to actually stand by your version?
Yes, and that logic is sound. There's only one question we have to answer. If it is a Torah mandated oath, I have to find where in the Torah it's mandated. So psychologically, absolutely, you're correct. Psychologically, I need to leverage this guy. I've got to see, will he hang on to his claim or not? So that's an excellent insight. And by the way, sorry, Yossi, one sec. When we eventually learn this in the Gemorah and we examine the psychology behind the guy who's making this claim, you'll see what you say makes a lot of sense. Sorry, Yossi.
Unless there's a chance that the guy might make a mistake and he doesn't remember what he paid, and then you make him take an oath in Hashem, which is a big punishment.
Fair point. That is a very good point, and that's possible, but it's not common. So it's possible, but we always make laws for the most common scenarios. You can't make a law for every single situation. But it's a very good point.
But didn't you say the rabbinical, we don't want to use the Torah oath because I don't know, you said it creates a behavior or something?
In our Mishnah, because we're not coming from the position that somebody is necessarily lying, we don't want to impose a Torah oath on them because it's a very serious thing. But here again, as you'll see when we get to the Gemorah, we're not necessarily accusing somebody of dishonesty, but we do believe that the person could be dishonest in their own heads. And again, the psychology over here is going to be a self-protection psychology. We'll get there. Okay. So in order to do this, we're going to look at another Mishnah from another tractate. The tractate is called Shavuos, nothing to do with the holiday. Shavuos is the tractate that speaks about the laws of oaths. So, oaths. So if you want to know anything about taking an oath, that's your Gemorah. Right? Go look at, and you'll find everything you need to know in that Gemorah. So I've got the full Mishnah here with the full English over here. Let's go through it together. Okay? Shavuos ha-dayonin. The oath administered by the judges. Now, the minute you see that, an oath administered by the judges, you probably assume it means it's a rabbinic oath, because that's what it sounds like, right? An oath administered by the judges. But that's not what the Mishnah intends. The Mishnah is saying an oath that the Torah requires the judges to administer. That's Shavuos ha-dayonin. Now, in context, that Gemorah in Shavuos, a big part of what it does is talks about the various kinds of oaths. You know, the various stringencies of oaths and the various circumstances where oaths are applied, etc., etc. So here's talking about Shavuos ha-dayonin, the oath administered by the judges because the Torah insists that they have to administer it. So what's an example? First, before we can get to the example, the Mishnah wants us to know that a claim has to have a certain value to it before you're going to make somebody take an oath. Right? You're not going to go through the process of an oath for something that is a negligible amount. So it's got to have a basic amount. Okay, you ready for this? Here's the example. Hataino shtei kesef. If the claimant says, you owe me 2 pieces of silver. Remember, in those days, coins were not really the value. It was the actual metal that was worthwhile. So the person says, you owe me 2 pieces of silver. And the defendant says, I don't owe you what you're claiming from me. I don't owe you 2 pieces of silver. I owe you less. But the less that is claiming has to be at least the value of a pruta, which was the smallest coin denomination in those days. In other words, if he'd be saying that I owe less than that, he'd basically be saying I owe nothing. So, for example, could you imagine? It would sound completely ridiculous. Can you imagine in today's world, you went to somebody and you say, listen, you owe me $100, and they say, no, I don't. I owe you 5 cents. In our world, you wouldn't litigate for 5 cents. Let's be honest. In fact, I'm not sure you would litigate for 100 rand either, but that's besides the point, right? But we all acknowledge that if something doesn't have some kind of intrinsic value, it's not worth the court system. So that's the first thing the Mishnah wants us to know. that the claim has to be a decent claim, 2 pieces of silver, and the rebuttal has to be at least something that has minimum value. A pruta in those days could still buy you something. So, if your grandparents told you the stories about how they could take a tikkie and go to the cinema and get popcorn and take the bus and all of those things, you must know that a pruta in those days could buy even more than that, even though it's the smallest coin denomination. So that's the first thing the Mishnah wants us to know. We're not going to impose an oath on somebody who's making a nonsensical denial claim, right? Which I owe some trinket of money. That's not worth anything. Rule number 2. Ve'im ein ha'hoida'a mimin ha'taina potur. If the nature of this person's acknowledgement, his admission of debt, is not in the same realm as the accusation against him, then he's not going to have to do whatever the process is, which we're going to get to now. Shvuas Hadayanim, it's the oath, which we're going to get to in a second. So what does that mean? So the classic example that the Gemorah uses is Ta'anoi chitim v'hoidoloi bisa'orim, which is the person says, you owe me a bag of wheat, and he says, nonsense, I only owe you half a bag of barley. Okay, well then, you're talking about wheat, you're talking about barley, it's not even the same conversation. We're not going to take that through the courts. We're not going to make you do whatever you've got to do over here, which we'll see in a moment, because you're not even talking the same language. It has to be that the guy said, you owe me 1,000 rand, and he says, no, only 500. Or it has to be that you owed me a consignment of textiles, and he says, I owed you a smaller consignment of textiles. Those are the kinds of things that would fit into this particular case of what we call moideh b'miktas, where somebody is making a partial admission to the claim against them. Ketzad. So now the Mishnah is giving us the example. Ketzad, how does this work? Shtei kesef li beyodecha. So Mark walks over to Yossi and he says, you have in your hand, which basically means in your possession, 2 pieces of silver that are mine. Now how that got there, could be I lent it to you, could be I asked you to safeguard it for me. Fact is, your claim is, you have 2 pieces of silver that belong to me. And the implied message is, you got to give them back. And he says, Yossi says back, Ein lecha biyadi ela pruta. No, that's not true. You only have in my possession much less than that. 1 pruta. So what do we say? Potter. We don't take you through the court system, because he's talking about silver, and you're talking about a pruta, which is made out of? Made out of copper. Remember, in those days, money is not about the denomination, it's about the actual metallurgical value. So, silver and copper, it's not the same thing. In our world, of course, cash is cash. In our world. Because our money is not really money, it's just tokenism for money, right? It's what does it say? Pay tender, or whatever the expression is, right? But in those days, silver was one class of material and copper was a different class of material. And if somebody is claiming silver from you and you say, I owe you copper, you're not speaking the same. It's like apples and oranges. So Potter, that person then, the defendant, is excused from having to get up in court and do the Shvuas Hadayanim, to do this oath, which is administered to him. We still haven't seen yet what the oath is. But if Mark said to Yossi, you have 2 pieces of silver of mine, and you have a pruta coin of mine, and Yossi says, I don't know where you got that silver thing from, but I actually do have a pruta of yours. So you did acknowledge part of what he was asking for. In that case, chayav. In that case, you're required to take an oath.
But that's almost like a get out of jail free, the previous one. Because you say I owe you something, I say I owe you a goat.
You owe me apples, I say I owe you oranges, and that's an amount.
Yeah, exactly. Assuming, of course, that you're a half decent, honest person, you hopefully will not be doing that. So let's finish the mission, and then I'll share with you the 2 psychological principles, even though we're going to see them later on in the Gemorah. But they're extremely valuable at this point. Otherwise, the whole thing doesn't really make a lot of sense. Let's just finish the Mishnah. So here's another scenario. So I come over to Charlie and I say, Mone li biyadecha. You have 100 zuz of mine. Zuz was the currency in those days. You have 100 zuz of mine. Charlie says, Ein lecha biyadi. What are you talking about? I don't owe you a cent. Not a cent. Potter. Charlie doesn't have to take this oath. Whereas, and here's the classic illustration of Moide b'miktzas, Mon eli biyadecha. I say, Charlie, you have 100 zuz of mine. Ein lecha biyadi ele 50 dinar. And he says, no, that's not true. I only have 50 dinar. Dinar, zuz, pretty much interchangeable terms. So I'm saying you have 100 dinar of mine. You say I only have 50. Haha, that's exactly classic Moide b'miktzas. That's exactly what we mean when we say that you're acknowledging part of the claim against you. Chayav, you are now required to take an oath. So, first question is, what would the oath sound like? I swear that...
Swear that I only owe you or that you owe me.
No. The oath is always imposed on the defendant in this case. So what? I swear that I only owe you 50 dinar. That's the oath. So, moide b'miktzas hatayno, any person who acknowledges part of the financial claim against him, in the absence of witnesses and documents, etc., Yeshava has to take an oath. That oath is mandated by the Torah. We'll see that on the next page, where the source is in the Torah. Because if it's mandated by the Torah, it's got to be stated in the Torah, right? You can't just thumbsuck and say, yes, I believe this is what the Torah said. That's nonsense. The Torah must say it. Even though the way that the Torah says this is going to be very interesting. But anyway, so the point is, Yeshava, that person has to take an oath. What is the nature of the oath? They have to be willing to say exactly what they said in their defense, but under oath. Now, why do we believe that this is going to work? So the first... Conscience. Yes, exactly. Now, let's talk about that for a second. If somebody's claiming that you owe them money, how did you land up in that position? Either you received something, exactly. Either they lent you money, or they did a job and you owe them payment for the job, or they asked you to look after something and you have to return it. The most common scenario that we're talking about over here is a loan. Why? Because the person says 100 and you say 50. That's the most common scenario, right? I lent you $100 and you only lent me 50. So let's focus on that one because that's the one that's going to be easiest for us to understand. If somebody's lent you money, psychologically, you are going to feel that you owe them something, not just the money. You're going to feel that you owe them some dignity as well. And so we assume that if you're the beneficiary of somebody's generosity, you are not going to have the chutzpah to look them in the eye and pretend it never happened. I mean, there are pathologies out there, but the average person, remember again, the guiding principle of all halacha is halacha must speak about the majority of the population. So yes, you will have people out there who are off the wall, who have absolutely zero conscience. We're not talking about them. We're not talking about a sociopath over here. We're talking about an ordinary person. So an ordinary person, and we'll know this from our own experience, if somebody has been good to us, it's very difficult in that context for us to be bad to them. Maybe in a different context, but in that context. So therefore the Gemorah assumes this. If I'm willing to look the claimant in the eye and say, I don't owe you a cent, it's most likely that that's true. But the minute I say I owe you less than what you're claiming, that illustrates that I'm uncomfortable to deny the claim against me. And if I'm uncomfortable, then the onus is on me to defend my position, because I'm already illustrating that it's probably likely that what he's saying is true, and I can't flat out deny it, so that's why I'm saying I only owe part. Now, here's the question. If I feel that the person's done something beneficial to me and I don't want to be bad towards them in response, then why wouldn't I just say I owe you all the money? Why would I play this game? Why would I say I only owe you half the money or a third of the money or whatever the fraction might be?
If you're saying if he actually does owe the full money, what was your scenario?
Okay, so let's go back. If I don't owe you anything, I'll happily say I don't owe you anything. If I do owe you money, I don't want to say to your face, listen, I don't owe you anything. So why don't I just say, yes, it's true, I owe you the money. Can we make a payment plan?
Because he believes that he doesn't.
If he believes that he doesn't, he'll say he owes
He
nothing.
doesn't owe you the full amount. I mean, the amount that he's claiming.
Okay, that may be possible, and we're going to test that with an oath. But it may also be possible that he doesn't have the money currently, and he's playing for time. So he doesn't have the chutzpah to say, I owe you nothing, because that would be a lie, and he's not a
I
liar.
think that's more unlikely than the error. Because you're acknowledging you owe something to the same person that helped you. So you say, I can pay you partly now. You know, there's a different path that you can take to keep without having.
You're saying you could ask for a payment plan, right?
Well, you can ask, yeah. I mean, you can expose your circumstance and engage. You know, like it's far better to do that than to flat out deny.
100%. So we'll do that when we get to the Gemorah. But the high level of the psychology is basically the person is saying, I know I'm going to have to pay this, but hopefully if I say I only owe X, for now we'll deal with X, and then later we'll deal with the remainder. That's kind of what's going through his mind.
You're saying he's a
So
dishonest person then.
he's a what?
A dishonest person.
Well, that's the thing. If a person does something that sounds dishonest, it doesn't mean that they intended to be dishonest. And that's what the oath is going to test. The oath is going to test. If we impose the oath on you now, and what you were saying actually wasn't honest, it's going to be your moment of realizing, I should never have said that. But when people are desperate, and around finances, people are often desperate, they will do desperate things, including pretending that they don't owe all the money. I mean, anybody who's ever been in the community space knows very well the kind of stories that people will come up with when you tell them, listen, you made a pledge on Simchas Torah 5 years ago and we still haven't seen it, right? You'll know how creative people can be with their stories instead of just saying, I don't have the money right now. You know, the people are shemzach a little bit. I don't want to be that person who says I don't have the money. So we have to acknowledge that when it comes to uncomfortable financial situations, people often do things that are irrational. This is their reality check. The court is saying, right, hold that Torah in your hands, use Hashem's name, state your claim. Unless you are rock solid in that defense, you are not making that oath.
It's reading it out.
Correct. So that is the principle of Moide Memikta Sataina Yeshava, which is going to be a very, very big chunk of the next Gemorah that we're learning. That is the first layer of our conversation. That's only getting us to where we need to get to. But before we can get to where we get to, let's at least find a source in the Torah that tells us that there is such a thing as an oath when a person only acknowledges part of the claim against them. Where does the Torah say this? And you're going to love this because the Torah doesn't say it in black and white. So this is Parshas Mishpatim, the 22nd chapter of the book of Shmois. Parshas Mishpatim, for those people who are aware, is one of 3 parashas in the Torah that is jam-packed with mitzvahs. It's like a competition. Which one has the most mitzvahs, you know? Is it Mishpatim? Is it Kedoshim? Is it Kiseitze? Who's got the most mitzvahs? So Mishpatim speaks about many of the financial claims. A lot of the laws of financial claims are in Mishpatim. You'll see that the first part is lighter because the first part is just an introduction to where we need to get to in the verse. So let's do the whole verse or series of verses, because 3 verses, and then let's just get the context. You ready for this? You really have to think like a Gemorah scholar at this point. Okay, here goes the pasuk. Ki yitain ish el re'ehu. When a person gives to his friend kesef, silver or money, Oi kalim, or any other items. Kalim directly translates as vessels, but it pretty much means, any kind of assets that a person has. Lishmor, and he says, I want you to look after them for me. But it's not such a good end to the story. V'gunav mi beiso ish, and whatever it is that you gave the person for safekeeping was then stolen from his home. Says the Torah, Im yimotzeh ganov yeshalem shnoim. If we can find who the thief is, the thief will have to pay plus a 100% penalty. That's not the focus of our discussion this evening. It's just an introduction. Then it carries on. Im lo yimotzeh ganov. What happens if you don't find the ganov? Then v'nikrav bal abayis eloi lekim. Then the owner of the item that was stolen has to approach Elokim, which is code for the courts. Right? It's code for the courts. There are a few verses in the Torah where the word Elokim is used to refer to the courts. And what does he have to say, the custodian? What does he have to say in front of the courts? Because again, it's very unfortunate if something was stolen. I asked you to look after something for me, and now it got stolen from you. It's very unfortunate, but at the end of the day, you're not necessarily liable. It would depend on the circumstances. Under certain circumstances you are, and other circumstances you are not liable. Here at this point we're talking about somebody who's doing you a favor. So obviously if somebody's doing you a favor, we're not going to hold them to the highest level of liability, but we have to check one thing. What's the one thing? We have to check that the custodian did not decide to use the item for himself, because he has no right to do that. You gave him something to look after. You didn't give him something to use. So if he uses it, he has breached the trust of this agreement, and now he'd be liable for anything that goes wrong. So that's what the courts want to test. They want to test, did you look after this item, or did you now go use it? So for example, it's the guy who says, do me a favor, just look after my Rolex for me. And then he comes to collect. What happened to my Rolex? Terrible story, it was stolen. You're kidding, you had a break-in. He says, no, it was stolen when I was wearing it at the mall. Who gave you the right to wear it? You're supposed to put it in your safe and leave it there. So that's what the courts have to test. And then the Torah starts to unpack the various scenarios. I'll call devar pesha, any time that custodian was negligent or reckless or irresponsible, whether it is al shor al chamor, whether it was when he was looking after a donkey, first an ox and then a donkey. So let's say, for example, you ask him, look after the ox, and he says, terrible thing happened. The ox got stolen at the rodeo. Right? It's a big problem. Al seh, or if it was a sheep. Al salmo, or if it was an item of clothing. Al kol aveda, or anything that gets lost. Here comes the key words. As you can see, it's highlighted. Asher yomar, where the custodian will say in his defense, ki hu zeh. What does that mean? Ki hu zeh. Can you translate that in colloquial English? Ki hu zeh.
This is it.
Exactly. Or as we say in colloquial English, what do we say in colloquial English? It is what it is. No, but that's not what he's saying. It's not saying it is what it is. He's saying ki hu zeh. These are the facts of the case. These are the facts of the case. The two of them will then go to court. And if we can prove that the custodian was irresponsible, he has to pay the double to the owner, because he's as bad as the ganef, essentially. Now, where do you see anything over here about a person admitting part of what's claimed against him? Nowhere, right? You see it exactly. You see it exactly there in those words. Ki hu zeh says, this is my version of the story. Ki hu zeh. The Gemorah understands from this. It's a little bit more elaborate. I didn't put it all in over here. There's a whole gezerah shava, which is essentially where you take similar or the same words in one verse and you link them to the same words in another verse, and then you cross-reference the two verses. We're not doing that now, but basically the Gemorah does link this to another pasuk, and in the other pasuk it talks about the fact that you take an oath, and it has similar language to here. But the point that we need to know is, when a person makes a strong claim to say ki hu zeh, this is exactly what happened. You saying that I owe you 1,000, I'm saying ki hu zeh. The facts of the case are, I owe you 500. They have to go to the courts, and the courts will not make him pay double as here, but they'll make him take an oath to verify his case. So this is actually the origin or the Torah source for this principle of moide b'miktas hatayna yeshava, that when a person admits part of a claim against him, he's got to take an oath. So far, everything that we have learnt is considered to be widely known and accepted. Your average kid who's learnt a little bit of Gemorah probably knows this principle. Moide b'miktas hatayna yeshalem, that if a person acknowledges part of the claim against them, they've got to take an oath. And then if they're willing to take that oath, that's all they have to pay. That's not what our Gemorah is going to be talking about. That is just the introduction to our Gemorah. Our Gemorah is going to be more interested in the next case, represented by the 4 stick figures in the new cartoon, which is the same original characters. You owe me $1,000. The guy says, no, I owe you nothing. Pause. if we could freeze the cartoon at this point, where the guy says, you owe me $1,000, and the other guy says, I owe you nothing, what would the halacha be at that point? There's no way you can make him pay. Your word against your word. We do not take money from somebody. Hamoitzi, we've learned this expression before. Hamoitzi mechavero. If a person wants to take money away from another person, olav horaya, the onus of proof is on him. There's no proof. It's your word against your word. That's it. Except in this case, they are witnesses. Now, what did we say would happen if they're witnesses? And the witnesses come along and say, yes, you owe the 1,000. What would happen? He'd have to pay the 1,000. You don't even need the courts. You only need the courts if he won't respect the witnesses. But if there are two witnesses who say you owe the 1,000, gesundheit, there you go, you pay it. This is a different scenario. The claimant says, you owe me $1,000. The defendant says, I owe you nothing, nada, zilch, zero. And the next thing, two witnesses come along and they say, you're wrong and you're wrong. Right? Like the classic Jewish thing in reverse. You're right and you're also right. This is the opposite. They come along and say, you're wrong and you're wrong. It's not $1,000 as you're claiming. It's not zero as you're claiming. It's $500. Question now is, this is witnesses. Witnesses are saying that he pays $500. Question is, does he pay or does he take an oath? That's the beginning of the conversation of this next piece in our Gemorah.
Does who take an oath?
The defendant. The defendant.
Zero guy.
The zero guy. Does he have to take an oath?
So it's
Okay.
always the defendant that has to take the oath, never the accuser.
If somebody makes a claim against somebody else, usually the person who is being claimed against has to somehow defend himself if there's no direct proof to take the money from him. So his best defense is to say there's no such case. And that's all he has to do. Over here, things have changed. There is, well, in the first case, he's put himself into a compromised position because he said, I owe something. So now you've got to defend that position. Here, the question is, what's supposed to happen? Is he supposed to defend, or is the other guy supposed to just lose his 500? How does this work? Okay? Okay? So that's going to be, as I said, that's the beginning of the conversation we're going to have in this Gemorah. However, just to tease you, because we're going into Pesach and it's going to be Yontif for 2 weeks, and you're going to have to remember this for a long time. Just to tease you, look at page 32. We have to get through that whole table and understand all of these scenarios, including the ones that are blank, because the ones that are blank are the ones that the Gemara is going to be debating. So we've got to know that, we've got to understand kind of the nature of this whole table to be able to start the next Gemara.
So without the witnesses, you say that there wouldn't be an oath. Now you're questioning, should you take an oath to say that you owe me
Without
nothing?
the witnesses, nothing would happen. No oath and no payment. The question is, now that there are witnesses, does that make payment or does that make an oath?
No, it would be by the guy who says, I owe you
By the
nothing.
guy who's saying nothing. Right? We're going to have to see.
And if he does do that oath?
Oh, we're going to have to see what kind of an oath it is, what's the nature of that. We're going to have to see all of that. But this is
What's the outcome of it be?
correct.
Witnesses
Correct.
have taken oath.
And then what? How does that track back to our Mishnah? Because that's why we're having this conversation in this Gemorah, even though it's not about this Gemorah, because the rabbi being quoted believes that our Mishnah supports his opinion in this debate. Okay, but we're not ready for the debate yet. We still have more information that we have to kind of understand and clarify. And once we have that, then we'll be able to go further and kind of start unpacking all this.